This video is about the random twists and turns of fortune that affected my attempts to make it easier to cycle in the town where I live and to ultimately tackle climate change. The story so far: the council are planning to build a cycle path on a busy road near where I live. It's all been very positive, but there hasn't been much progress for over a year, and there won't be any until we can find the money to build it. Our campaign group has effectively broken up. Some were never that committed in the first place. One moved away. One was too old to do anything more than send me encouraging emails. 2 people had a big falling out via email, and both left the group. I still use the word we when talking to the council, even though now it's just me. Keeping everyone enthusiastic and organised in the campaign is always very difficult. Disagreements on what to do are common and difficult to resolve. People in authority ignore or delay responses to campaigns, knowing the longer it goes on, the more likely they are just to fade away. The cycling group in Springfield have an organising committee, a chairperson, a treasury and other posts, but it just seems too much work to me. You can spend all of your time typing up meeting minutes and never really get anywhere. Fortune. Stoics use the word fortune in a very specific way. It represents things that you can't control. Sometimes they refer to it as a goddess that deliberately tests you. To have a peaceful mind, a Stoic has to respond in one of 2 ways. Number 1, you treat it with disdain and take no notice of it. So, no gambling, no politics. You have to avoid relying on the law because the twists and turns of a court case are full of fortune and the process is so unreliable. Number 2, whether good or bad fortune comes your way, you treat it as a test. Quite often you can't control the things that happen to you, but you can control how you respond to them. Things that happen to you are neither good or bad because there's nothing you can do about them. The only thing that happens is how you respond to events. Success comes to the common person and even to commonplace ability, but to triumph over the calamities and terrors of mortal life is the part of a great person only. You are a great person, but how do I know it if fortune gives you no opportunity to show your worth? Remember that bit about success comes to the common person and even to commonplace ability for later in the video. In the video, every time something important happens that I had no control over, I'm going to point it out as a piece of fortune. In Britain, money for things like new roads and cycle paths comes from either central government or what are called 106 payments, which are made by a property developer in return for planning permission. I kept a lookout for funding from central government. Most of this type of spending in Britain is on roads. Some money is provided to encourage walking and cycling, but it's quite limited. I looked through the planning applications but couldn't find anything. Right, here comes the first bit of fortune. A property developer proposed redeveloping the old industrial area. It would be a big project with plenty of 106 money. I emailed the planners at the county council. They hadn't been told about it yet, but they started to do things. A few months later, and the developers publish glossy online documents. Plus, there are hundreds of planning documents to be read. Here comes a second piece of fortune. The council stated planning permission would only be granted if the developers made the best possible use of opportunities to reduce reliance upon the private motor car to the detriment of the local environment and the locality. Remember, Britain is a country where the answer to all transport problems is more cars. I made my constructive comments. The developers didn't reply to me directly, but they seemed to incorporate some of my suggestions in their plans. They stated they were keen to build the Danger Road cycle path. That's a third piece of fortune. I pointed out that between the industrial area and the train station, it was only an 8-minute cycle ride, and it was all on either very quiet roads or completely off-road. Now for the fourth piece of fortune. A Shelby comrade emailed me something I misunderstood. I thought they meant make sure it's a good quality route to the train station, but really he just meant point out that it is actually possible. So by accident, I go into design consultant mode. The only problem was the last 500 metres. People do cycle along it now, but it's very narrow. And because it runs through a narrow gap between the train station and the lake, there wasn't any real prospect of making it wider. I suggested a ramp that would lead up through the station car park, and then you could miss out that narrow section and you could just cycle through the car park. Here's the red line I drew along the narrow stretch. The line is going to be important later on in the video. I won't tell you why, but I'm going to call it now the £2 million red line. Then one day I was cycling past and noted work had started at the industrial site. The fifth piece of fortune. An email to my planning contact was replied a few days later by a different person. And the reply was just an acknowledgement that planning had been granted. although they did tell me the cycle path would be funded and it would likely be built within the next 3 years, so the 6th piece of fortune. This might sound like good news, but remember, there's still quite a serious issue with the width of the path and the safety buffers. I'd been promised we'd resolve that issue when funding became available. I phoned the new contact, but I didn't manage to get much more information from him. Certainly, he wouldn't send me the design of the path they were planning to build. So something's changed now. I studied the 106 agreement that I found online. It's effectively a legal agreement between the council and the developers. So, £481,000 for the cycle path, including the £188,000 that had already been provided that we saw in the last video. £481,000 seemed a suspiciously specific amount of money for a cycle path that still had important design issues to be resolved. Trying to be a good Stoic, I always reminded myself that what the council decided to do was down to them. But by now, I felt responsible for something that I thought might be dangerous and difficult to use. It's a similar situation to my failing YouTube channel. No matter what you tell yourself, once you've invested time into something, it's quite difficult not to care about it, even if it is beyond your control. We are plunged by our blind desires into ventures which will harm us and certainly will never satisfy us. For if we could be satisfied with anything, we should have been satisfied long ago. There is no one in the world content with their prosperity, nor do we reflect how pleasant it is to demand nothing, how noble it is to be content and not depend on fortune, how important it is to sit in the woods without a care. So there's still some work to do to improve my Stoic virtues. Remember, I don't make these videos for you lot, I make them to help myself. That's probably why nobody watches them. I'm not the doctor, I'm the patient. I thought that now the money had been agreed, there was no realistic chance of changing the design. I felt cheated. But you have to remember, there are no guarantees in this world, even if people do promise you things. I didn't feel cheated because someone hadn't kept a promise. I felt cheated because I'd forgotten how the world works. What might have seemed good news could be seen as a disaster. Money available, but now used to build a dangerous path. But since I had no control, neither were good or bad. Good people should not shrink from hardships and difficulties, nor complain against their fortune. They should take it in good part, whatever happens, and turn it to good. Not what you endure, but how you endure it is important. I decided to carry on helping the council to improve their design for the path, whether they liked it or not. I wrote to one of 2 county councillors who represent the town. He sounded sympathetic and wrote to the head of the county's highways department, the 8th piece of fortune. I created a Facebook group and stood at the side of a cycle path on another part of the route between Springfield and Shelbyville, together with someone from the Shelbyville cycling group. We handed out leaflets that showed the plan. We spoke to people who were cycling. We did our own little traffic census, asking where people were cycling to and from. 1 or 2 people were concerned, but the great majority said they would be happy to have any path, and sounded glad when we said it would be built within the next 3 years. Only about 10 people joined our group, a 9th piece of fortune, so we were hardly a mass movement. I spoke at the Springfield cycling group. They asked me such difficult questions, I wondered whose side they were on, and I don't really like speaking in public. I get so nervous, I do not enjoy it at all. I spoke at the Shelby cycling group. They're much more positive. I was also a bit cross because there was no mention of making it easier to cycle to the train station in the 106 agreement. But then I noticed something. Pounds was to be spent on the woods. Mostly small things, but including improvements to the path to the south and west of the lake. So maybe there was still a chance of a cycle route to the station. I emailed the volunteers who look after the woods, asking if they would support making it easier to cycle through the woods to the train station. I got a very grumpy reply telling me if it was down to them, they would make it more difficult to cycle in the woods. Here's the 10th piece of fortune. Although they hate cyclists, they're not complete bastards. They told me the width of the narrow paths by the lake would be doubled. They hadn't wanted it, but the county council had seemed quite insistent, so rather than spend a couple of £1,000 on a ramp for the steps so you could push your bicycle up it, they decided to widen the path instead, the 11th piece of fortune. I thought back to a phone call I'd had with one of the planners. The trouble with vague, secretive phone calls is that you sometimes misunderstand what the other person means. If I'd have understood it, I might have suggested spending it elsewhere. Still, £2 million was always welcome. The 12th piece of fortune. It would have been difficult for the council to declare them proper cycle paths. They wouldn't have been able to use lighting or tarmac because of the protected status of the woods, but they had done something. You might be a bit cross now. I made a video about how I got £2.5 million spent on cycling infrastructure, and it turns out that £2 million of that was the result of drawing a red line on a map and several misunderstandings. But remember where this video started. Success comes to the common person and even to commonplace ability. Sometimes you hear someone being described as being stoical because they've had a bad experience or some bad news and they're trying to be positive about it. But if you want a peaceful mind, it's just as important to be unreliant and unmoved by good fortune as by bad. If you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same. The widths of the Danger Road cycle path and its safety buffers still needed to be resolved, and all my emails received unhelpful replies. Then the Shelbyville Cycle Group got an email from a councillor from another part of the county, the 13th piece of fortune. His email said that next week there'd be an opportunity to directly address the county council. This was too good an opportunity to miss. So watch out for the next video. Good morning. It's quite exciting cycling on ice.
Well.